when it comes to music, this is probably the art form that you really deal with. It's in your life more frequently than any other. You're probably listening to music when you wake up, when you do your homework, as you walk to class, maybe elsewhere as well. And that's why it's so important. Now, due to limitations online, it's difficult to get into the history of a lot of music without showing you examples, which of course causes copyright issues. So what I will do is handle that typically in class or elsewhere. And here I'm going to focus on musical composition so that you can better understand and better appreciate what you're hearing. Now, at a basic level, music is the purest form of art. After all, it exists outside the physical restrictions of space. You don't have to worry about the size of a canvas or a piece of stone or a building site. You don't have to worry about these physical limitations. And so in a lot of ways, it's seen as this pure form beyond all of it. So let's talk about composition. Now, when we get into composition, it's basically the structure of a piece. Music is, of course, a language in and of itself, just like visual arts can be argued to be a language. And what we're going to do here is delve into the creation of the composition and its makeup. We're focusing here on 6 basic elements that we're going to discuss, which will be sound, rhythm, melody, harmony, tonality, and texture. And we're going to deal with each one. Some of them we will break down further as needed. So just kind of keep going with the flow. You'll get all of this eventually. Now, at a very basic level, of course, music is nothing more than sound. So music is made up of sound and silence, just like the use of form and negative space in visual arts. What is sound? Sound is the vibration that's happening between air molecules from the sound itself, whether it be, or the source of the sound. It could be a musical instrument, it could be a voice, it could be a tree falling in the woods. But that's basically sound. This is why you can't have a concert in outer space, as it were, because there's no air molecules and therefore no way for vibration to travel. Now, music attempts to control and shape sound. It's taking the sound portion of those sounds and silences and shaping them, but it's also going to shape the silence, creating a negative space that you read just as much as you would the sound itself. And there are 4 basic properties of musical sound that we're going to be dealing with: pitch, dynamics, tone color, and duration. Now, pitch is the relative highness or lowness of a sound measured in vibrations per second. It is a steady, constant frequency. In fact, you can download a tone generator or pitch generator onto your phone and put in any number of different pitches measured in these vibrations, and it will give you this steady buzz or steady siren or whatever you want to describe it as. The higher the frequency, the higher the pitch. Now, low-pitch instruments tend to be large to accommodate these large, slow-moving waves. And one other thing to understand is as we age, even as a college-age student, you have probably lost some of your hearing at the high end of pitch. After all, there are 11,000 distinct pitches that the human ear can pick up. As you age, you lose the high end. This is why the elderly frequently have a hard time hearing people with high-pitched voices. But if you lower your voice, it becomes much easier for them to understand. Now, of course, 11,000 pitches is completely impractical when it comes to a musical instrument. You would have a guitar that's about a mile wide. You would have a piano that you would need an incredible aerobic capacity to play. So what do? We break these pitches down. First, into a series of octaves. Now, the octave is simply splitting up that general scale, that general pitch, those general pitch levels. And when you hear someone say, hey, sing an octave lower or an octave higher, that's what they're referring to, basically moving up one scale, as it were. And so these will form our basic scale. Each octave is again split into a series of 8 pitches. These we would recognize as musical notes. And the distance between the pitches is the interval. And this is the difference in pitch between two sounds. Now, if you do some quick math, that means we're taking 11,000 different pitches and we're boiling them down into somewhere between 50 and 100 different sounds known as notes. Now, non-Western music does not follow this scale. This is purely Western here. So moving forward, we also have dynamics. This is the volume of the sound. This is how loud or soft a sound in music is. This is measured in decibels. And it's basically the size of the sound wave from the top to the bottom rather than its frequency. Then we have tone color, also known as timbre. And this is the difference in sound between two different sources. Perhaps two different voices, which of course are going to sound different, or two different instruments playing the same note. Of course, if I play a C on a flute and on a guitar, it's going to have certain qualities and certain differences. So tone color allows us to distinguish a pitch from a violin from one played, for example, on a piano. Duration is how long you're going to hold that note, or in more technical terms, the length of time vibration continues without interruption. So, for example, with a piano piece, it might be how long am I holding that key before I play the next one, or something similar on a guitar. This tends to be denoted in sheet music by symbols, from whole notes to 64th. Then we have rhythm, which is a recurring series of pulses and accents that create an identifiable pattern. So what you're looking at when you're looking at rhythm is basically a series of beats. Each one will repeat. And so you might have 4 beats, and then those 4 beats repeat, and maybe the first one is the accent. And so that starts to give us a rhythm. Very basic, but it starts us down that path. And rhythm consists of 3 different parts: beat, meter, and tempo. Beat is the basic unit of time, the pulse that we get from music. If you're listening to pop music, rock, etc., it's probably going to be the bass drum, for example. And this is the individual regular pulse of sound. It creates the unit of time for the musical composition. The faster the beat, the faster the composition. Then, of course, rhythm cannot simply be made up of beat, otherwise it would be rather dull. You would just hear dun, 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 dun. And that's not terribly interesting. So we add meter. And this is where we get those accents. So this is which beat is going to be accented, or which one maybe is a little more quiet. It provides the pulse of the music. So now we know that we have some kind of recurring pattern. Maybe the first beat is going to be accented a little bit louder, and the next 3 are quieter, and then it repeats. But we still don't know how fast it needs to go. And that's where we get tempo. This is really the pace of the music, the rate of the composition, measured in beats per minute. This is why many musicians will use a metronome. It also explains why you listen to certain music at certain times. The body will have a physiological response to the music, which is why when you listen to faster music, maybe something in the 120 to 168 range, it's going to make you feel more energetic, more likely to work out. Whereas if you listen to something much slower, maybe in the 60 to 76 beat per minute range, that's sort of a resting heart rate for a lot of people, it's probably going to relax you. This is also why certain music works for workouts and certain music does not. So if you've ever been someone who kind of chooses music to be a soundtrack for different parts of your life, this is probably why you're choosing the songs that you're choosing. And you can match it to sort of the heart rate that you're aiming for, because the heart rate will increase or decrease to match the music in many cases. That being said, let's move on to melody, which is a linear succession of musical tones with rhythmic and tonal organization. Basically, what you're looking at in melody is a single line of sound. It's a single small child singing, or a single instrument. Very, very basic and very straightforward. It's sort of the basic unit of music beyond beat and sound. Now, if you have melody, that's great, but it's a little bit dull sometimes, so we want to add something else, such as harmony, where we see two or more tones sounding at the same time, usually at some kind of set interval. What does this mean in practice? This could be two people, two great heroes of music, such as David Bowie and Freddie Mercury, singing at the same time with some interval between their voices, creating this sense of harmony. Each one adding to the harmony and creating something much bigger than it would be individually. Then we also have tonality. And this is where a piece of music tends to start and return to at various times. So for example, if you've seen a piece of music and it says so-and-so symphony in C major, that gives you an idea of where it starts and then where that music might end up. Most songs will end up at the same home key that they start from. Now, obviously, there are going to be some songs that break the rules, like Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, which is perhaps the greatest piece of music ever written. And we have texture. This is how the composer uses melody in their composition. So, when we're looking at texture, we're looking at different lines of melody. This could be a symphony orchestra with, say, 20 different instruments, each one playing something slightly different, maybe at an interval in harmony, maybe something independent. But that gives the music texture. So there are three forms of texture that we typically see in Western music. There's monophony. This is a single line of melody. This is that single singer or a single musical instrument. If the singer is playing the musical instrument, by the way, it is not monophony. It is probably going to be homophony, which is this, where we have multiple parallel lines of melody. Could be different instruments, different voices, any number of different combinations, but they're all playing basically the same thing. It's the same sound, it's the same meter, it's the same rhythm. Everything is basically the same except for the timbre or the interval between the sounds. And timbre, by the way, is tone color. That's how we differentiate instruments. Or it could be a matter of simply the interval between the sounds, especially if we see, for example, two people singing. Finally, we have polyphony. Now, this is going to be a little more complicated. This is where we see two or more simultaneous lines of independent harmony. You will see this frequently, for example, in a symphony orchestra, or in a lot of pop music where we have a lot of background sounds going on and they're not all following exactly the same melody. Some are going to be a little bit different than others. It gives a certain complexity to the music and tends to draw us in. So, we also need to touch on opera, which is a form of musical theater. Here, the plot is played out through song, generally in Italian or in French. And opera kind of crosses the line sometimes between theater and music. Here we're dealing with it as music, but just understand it could fall into either category. Now, there are, of course, different types of opera. Opera, of course, is an attempt to revive the effects of ancient Greek theater beginning in the late 16th century in France. What they're trying to do is they're trying to recreate the sung experience of Greek theater, a lot of which would have been sung. Now, there's a reason for that, which is if you look at a lot of, for example, Greek literature, the Iliad, the Odyssey, these epic poems frequently would have been sung rather than spoken, because singing it is going to allow the speaker to remember the material much easier. It also allows for greater projection. And in a time when there is no amplification, that becomes very important. The French, of course, will try and recreate this form. It becomes very popular again in the late 16th and into the 17th centuries. So right around the Baroque period for art. And it will start to evolve from there. Now, there are 4 basic types of opera. There is grand opera. This is your serious or tragic opera, often with heroic subjects. These are the big, showy pieces. They tend to be tragic pieces. They tend to last 2.5 hours, but they're going to be very important, and they tend to be seen as higher class. Now, that last comment will make sense as we move through the other 3 forms. Opera comique is an opera where we see some spoken dialogue. Now, this is seen as a lesser form of opera, especially by the French in the 17th, 18th centuries. This would be similar to, for example, maybe the American musical. And I know some people might be saying you can't possibly put these 2 things together, but when you think about it, they're relatively similar. Now, opera comique is not necessarily a comedy. It is simply a lighter form. Then we have opera buffa. And here, this is going to be more of your comic or comedic opera. This is comedy being used as satire to treat a serious subject with humor. Imagine if I came out and criticized the president, and just came out and criticized him straight up, that's it. That could have, at various times in history, gotten me in a great deal of trouble. But if I do it with humor, like we see in the late night shows, or on various satire news shows, etc., you can get away with a little bit more. You can say the same thing, but if you're laughing, it's harder to behead you. And so that's where we're seeing this. You'll notice it's 18th century, the 1700s, a very revolutionary period in France specifically, but also generally throughout Europe. And then we have operetta, which is a form of theater and a sort of genre of light opera, where you're dealing with light subjects. These are stories that are comedies. These are stories of people falling in love. These are not terribly serious. They often have spoken dialogue, but tend to deal with popular light themes such as romance or humor. Now, this is considered a lesser form because it doesn't have the serious nature of the tragedies that we're used to seeing in opera. So, we also have the opera production. Opera is a collaborative art, just like theater. We need people who can sing as well as people who can act, which we know is quite difficult if you've ever seen Glee or any of those other shows where they kind of try and do that. Doesn't always work. Now, it's going to be written there's going to be a sort of script written known as a libretto. This is going to include the music as well as the words that are going to be provided. And this is the basis for the opera. The actors, of course, must both sing and dance. We also see a great many voice ranges from soprano to basso, all the way across. And of course, you don't have one person who's going to cover that entire range. Even Freddie Mercury doesn't quite hit all of those. Language, of course, becomes an issue, especially in the United States, where we don't understand Italian and French, which tend to be the primary languages for most opera. So what do? We subtitle it. You see the subtitles there above the stage. And anyone who has watched a movie with subtitles knows that it can take away from the experience because I'm half watching the movie and half reading what's going on. For some people, this isn't a problem. For others, it is. Now, the other thing that they can do, of course, is to create translations and simply translate the opera itself without the subtitles. The problem is, of course, words that might rhyme in Italian or French do not in English, and sometimes the ideas are lost. So modern operas will often have translated lyrics projected somewhere above the stage or around the theater. The opening of an opera is known as an overture. For example, the 1812 overture would be one of those pieces. It tends to be big and strong, just like we see in a musical. It draws you in. The plot will unfold through recitatives, which are narrations. Basically, there will generally be a narrator to guide you through the story. Then we see arias, which are solo pieces, very similar to soliloquies or monologues. We also have duets, trios, quartets, as well as the chorus, which leads to a question. If this is theater based entirely on singing, then is Hamilton actually an opera? This is generally considered to be a musical, but it doesn't actually have any spoken words. It deals with a tragic subject and would seem to fit almost all the criteria for opera. So, just something to think about moving forward.